So we're welcome everybody. Welcome to the show this week. This week we're going to do. It's kind of the name was more of a way to try to pull some people in, but it's fundamentally following that idea, and that is, can an old dog learn a new trick, quit or change? Because that usually gets us to that place that we we have to make a decision. And, if that decision's that we're going to continue on and just the way we are, or is that decision going to be, maybe it's time to, kind of hang it up, or is that decision we're going to double down and work on the things we said we're going to work on, and, and try to improve, because even as you have that many years in, and maybe there is something that you're running against. It's just putting the extra effort that gets you past that point. And we're going to talk about all of those things today, or a lot of those things today. And I think a number of us have experiences doing them. I know I have, and I'm going to try to hopefully get a chance to, kind of say what happened with me and what I do now, even to try to stay in that space a little bit of being able to change. But for me, it's kind of changing what I have. Today, we're going to a little bit more talk about, there's not only changing what you have, but changing full out. And it takes a lot more commitment. And originally, this show was brought up because of that. I've known a number of people that have come and said, I want to change everything. And they let go of the other stuff. And they committed to that change. And these weren't people that hadn't had success before. They're people that had really been very successful and made that commitment. And it amazed me. And that's the reason I really kind of want to talk about this today. I'm going to go ahead and introduce some folks. First, I'm going to say howdy to Captain Sivrid here, because he's our producer today, but he's coming back and making some wholesale changes himself. So I asked him to stay on the show, but it's we're rare that we get to see our producer, and I just wanted to give him a shout out, because those guys are the ones that do a lot of work for us. We have Duke Ronald from the east. We have Duke Eliahu from the middle, Viscount Tristan, North Shield, Sir Aelfwyn from Eldemir, and of course myself, Duke Brannos from the middle room. So while we're like good and into the show here, I'm just going to talk about what might cause the change real quick. And then I'm going to throw it over to Eliahu, because he's actually the one that originally kind of made me think about this episode. And he had some really good insight. And then we're going to cover a lot more after that. Some of the things the reasons you might have to change. One is, sorry, I apologize. One would be that you need to change. And this is probably one of the hardest ones, and that is your style's no longer successful or competitive, and that was a hard one. And this is what I think really the couple of people I worked with had to deal with, and that's even harder, because it wasn't caused by maybe them slowing down, because they threw fine blows that, the same blows they threw at me years ago and killed me with. It wasn't because they're returning after injuries, which is a reason why, another reason why you might have to change your style, maybe a little bit, or maybe all out. Those are just a couple. Some of the others is, you can't get off a plateau. We're going to talk about that a little bit. Maybe you're changing your weapon style or your shield style, and to fight long weapon, bastard sword, let's say, or two-handed weapon, your movement has to change. So you have to make some wholesale changes and dedicate to maybe doing stuff you haven't done for 10, 20 years. It's and this is another good one was. You move to another kingdom, and that kingdom style is significantly different. Their shields may be different. Their the weapons may be different. Maybe a lot of two-stick, or maybe a lot of thrusting. That can cause you to have to change all out in some cases. And sometimes you can modify for it. Sometimes you never become competitive again. So you have to make a wholesale change. And so that's kind of what we're trying to gear at, is that, we know that change is part of learning and staying competitive. The question is, are you willing to make that change? Eli,
Yes.
why don't you go ahead and talk a little bit about your experience?
So, okay. So about 20 years ago, I'd been fighting for more than 20 years. And I prefer to think of it as a system, not merely a style. The system I was using, system style, it was no longer effective. Um, Things had certainly changed significantly over the course of those years in the way people fought and the equipment they had. And I did have an injury and was coming back from it and thought, this is a good time to restart. I'm going to approach this, and this was not simply adding a new blow, adding a new skill, adding a new thing. I was endeavoring to make a complete change into a new system that I would then eventually add back into it the skills I already had. But to do this, there were several things I had to decide. And the first was letting go of ego and and practicing humility, honesty. The chivalric virtues, in practiced in this way, are what are commonly referred to as emptying your cup. That is, if you think you know everything, you can't learn anything because there's no room for it to go. So I had to say, yeah, and I remember approaching Brannos and say, I need to completely redo what I'm doing. I'm going to approach this. I'm just going to do what you say. I will do this. I'm going to, from the ground up, how to stand, how to move, how to everything. And I did that. And then the other condition for doing that I had to decide on was practice. There are practices, too many practices. We've talked about it on this a lot. Too many practices that are just sparring, and people try to win practice. Well, winning practice is not practicing. Practicing, drilling, repeating, getting feedback. You win practice when you are improving your mastery of a new skill or a new system. So it was not about in short words, you have to be willing to suck for a while if you're going to eventually get better because you're trying to learn something new. And I roughly calculating, I was changing my stance, everything, the way I moved, everything, and which included changing equipment. And I think I was doing at least 2 3-hour practices twice a week, plus 2 2-hour workouts each week for 2 years. And that's 1,200 hours and that doesn't include tournaments, which I would go to, but I would completely suck because I was in between systems. I remember times, Brannos, I remember telling you that I would get frustrated and I'd just go ahead and kill my opponent. And that I considered losing, not winning, because I was falling back to old habits rather than focusing on learning the new ones. And so that was, I might win the fight, but I was losing because I wasn't achieving my goal of learning the new system. And so it took a lot of time and a lot of focus, but it requires giving up for a time what you know. Now your body still knows how to do things. And eventually I found ways to bring back in stuff that I had previously done, but integrated into the new system I was learning. And paid off. The work paid off, I think, for me.
Yeah, I totally agree, and I think we'll talk at some point, talk a little bit about kind of the teacher's role on that. But Ronald, you had kind of a different experience. You went from one kingdom to another, right?
Yes. Uh, my my experience was I was very successful in the West Kingdom where I started. I was Prince of the Mist, then King of the West, one right after the other. I was 18 as Prince of the Mist and 20 as King of the West. So I excelled very young. But at 21, I moved to the East Kingdom, and I wanted to fight in their crowns, but their kingdom's fighting culture was starkly different. They use a lot more thrusting tips on broadswords, and they tend to use much larger shields. So I had to completely retool how I threw shots and how I approached the fight. When you're fighting as a smaller shield, a lot of my tactic was to snipe at the temple and snipe right above the knee. It was a speed and accuracy game. Well, when somebody's shield is 40 inches long, that no longer works at all. So but fortunately for me, I had a half wrap and offside game that I had to really put to the forefront to succeed. And so when I fought in Crown 6.5 months after moving, I had a game all set up, but I had to work very hard to change. At that point, what 6, 7 years of no, sorry, 7 or so years of fighting a certain way. I had to take another part of my skill set and move it to the forefront to win. So, and that worked well for many years, but now I'm getting older. Where I'm pushing 60 at this point, and after a number of knee surgeries and both shoulders being operated on, I can't move the same way I did back in my heyday. So I've been having to retool what I do considerably based on that. Um,
Yeah, I mean, and that's a huge one. I think that's a little bit of everybody that, there's. I think people start finding that throwing too many wraps, they or slowly kind of go away from them over time because of the shoulders and things like that. And the big shield stuff and other kingdom stuff is it's interesting. I was thinking about that one, and I think we're seeing a surge like in Ancestора, the two stick style that's starting to travel to society, that's making some major changes to people's styles as well. Um, Tristan, real quick,
well,
I love
it's
Eli.
interesting on Ancestora.
Go ahead, Ron. Did you say something?
Oh, interesting thing about Ancestora is our current crown prince won with a small shield, which
Yeah, which
would have
is
been unheard
weird.
of
Yep.
25, 30 years ago there.
Yeah.
Yeah. And he
It's
beat
so
all the two stick people using a small shield. So
yeah, exactly. Tristan, Eli brought up a point, and I think this one kind of falls on you, just because the martial arts background you have, and I liked it. Is like that whole 10,000 hour rule, right? Is not so accurate when you already know something, right?
Well, and Eli mentioned the empty cup, and this is something that I think every martial artist or sport fighter has heard, and maybe even heard kind of the whole parable of it, which is, a young swordsman comes to a sword master and he says, I want you to teach me. And the sword master says, well, what exactly would how can I help you, precisely? And where are you starting from? And he starts rattling on. Well, I've fought in a couple of battles, and I learned from this school, and I learned from that school, and I know how to do this, and I know how to do that. And the guy's just chattering on and on and on. And the master leans over and he grabs a pot of tea and he starts pouring into a cup, and he fills the cup up with tea, and the tea's just overflowing on the table, and he just keeps pouring and pouring and pouring. And suddenly the guy, the young warrior starts like, why are you pouring tea all over the table? He's like, this is the cup that is overfilled. You have all these things you already know. I can't give you anymore. Like you've suddenly given me a situation that I can't offer you anything. And I think ego is part of that. But I think another part, and this is maybe just my pragmatic perspective, is that for every hour that you learn something, it's like a wagon going over a road, and it starts to cut ruts in the road. And the more you go back and forth over that same road, the ruts get deeper and deeper and deeper. And you keep wanting to go back to that road rather than finding a new road. And if you want to go off the road, you have to get over those ruts, and they can be very, very difficult to get out of. And Eli had the perfect story of, when he was in a tournament, like you just said, and you fell back into your old habits because they were easy. They were there. Those are the deep ruts that you've carved in. And this is one of those reasons as an instructor, when I look at how I train my students and how I drill my students, I'm very careful not to make sure they carve the wrong ruts, because they'll always drift back to those habits that get reinforced, even in the first hours. And you can kind of view it like raising a child, where the imprints that a child gets on his first couple of years of living in this world are very deep. And it can take years and years and years to try to unlearn what they had learned when they were 2 or when they were a year and a half year old. And training a new fighter is exactly the same way. So when you're a coach, you have to be very careful of trying to avoid, you'll never be able to avoid it entirely, but try to avoid creating bad habits that will have to be unlearned to a very great degree sometime later on. And we're not all perfect. We'll always make some mistake, but the closer you can get to good form now, the more your student will not have to unlearn it later.
No, that's a good call. Eli, you had a comment about the 10,000 hour rule. You're on mute.
A lot of people have quoted the 10,000 hour rule, which came from a misunderstanding of a study, and it was based on some statistical analysis. The idea being that you had to spend 10,000 hours to become an expert, but it's the same thing as saying practice makes perfect. Well, only perfect practice makes perfect. You can spend 10,000 hours learning the wrong thing, and you won't be great. Now, people who are world-renowned musicians or dancers spend way more than that from a young age. But the main point is to learn either add a new skill to what you're doing or to completely revamp your system. You have to put in a lot of time to do it. It takes time, it takes persistence, and it takes the correct instruction, because whatever you learn, as Tristan was saying, the ruts you're digging, if you learn something wrong, it takes twice as long to learn something new as if you had learned it right the first time. To extend your analogy, you have to fill those ruts before you can dig new ones. And so it takes twice as long to do. It's not necessarily 10,000 hours, because we all do something other than just fight. But it does take dedication, persistence, perseverance, and work. Not necessarily 10,000 hours for what we're doing, but it takes time, and you have to put in the time. So if you see somebody quote that 10,000 hours figure, you can set that aside. But when you look at those of us who've been fighting a long time, and you look at how much time over the years we've actually spent training, practicing, working out, practicing on a pelt, going to practices, going to tournaments, working on our gear, all of that, it ends up being a lot of time.
Aelfwyn, you had I thought I'd pull you in and talk about, I mean, you put a lot of time in, and to me, like Eli was saying, is that time is not only just going to practice and doing that. It's everything from working out to watching video to thinking fighting to discussion about fighting. Just sitting and listening to this show is essentially making everyone think more about what they do and understand fighting better. And I think that all of those pieces feed into that 10,000 hours. But what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think you're right. We were chatting before. I've been fighting, 30 odd years now, and I have been keeping a fighting journal. So every now and again, I flip back through the old ones, and it was funny because I was going back through an old book, and I remember talking or doing some research on exactly this kind of problem a while back, and sure enough, 11 years ago, I had a bunch of research that I had done on deliberate practice and breaking out of a plateau. And it's like, there we are, exactly right there. So I've certainly done a certain amount of reading into not just, like you say, going to the gym and going to practice and going to tournaments and making sure your kit works properly, but also looking in the sports psychology end of things as well, because that's a big problem I've had is just my mental concentration, being ADD, and motivation is another big one. Because you get into this vicious cycle. You perform poorly, so that makes you depressed. You have low motivation, which gives you poor performance, and you end up in this vicious cycle. And you got to try to break yourself out of that and get yourself back going. And it's one of the lessons that I learned kind of the hard way, was not equating fighting well and winning, because you can fight poorly and win, and you can fight really well and lose. And that's a hard one to get your brain through sometimes. And as Eliahu was saying about poor practice, where somebody's using a poor technique, but it works. So there's a lot of motivation to continue using the poor technique, even though in the long run, it's going to be a dead end, or they're going to hurt themselves, or, any of that. So as a coach or a trainer seeing this, it's approaching that student and saying, I know you're winning with it, but I've got some experience here that this isn't going to work out for you in the long run. So you might want to try this or try that and try to modify their behaviors so that they don't get into these situations, these dead end situations.
Yeah. And actually, and I'm going to throw another piece in there just because I was reading a book about it. And that's what also counts in those hours is reflection. And that's it. And it counts huge, because going back and looking at your books and seeing where you were and thinking about your performance now and then is a big part of understanding what you need to change and seeing the difference and being able to, really impact how you proceed forward. And the book I was reading talks about reflection quite a bit. And I think it's something that probably most of us fail a lot at. And, they talk about like 15 minutes of reflection every day, an hour of reflection every week, and all the way to 1 year, taking a whole day or two to go somewhere and just reflect on what you did that year. Most of this was all about growth, the book I was reading, but I thought it was insightful. So, and I would agree 100%. You get a lot of people. Here's an example of living on something that may not be good for you in the long run, but hard to get away from, and that's speed, right? One of our biggest episode is, need for speed. And
there's a reason we chose that as the first topic.
Exactly,
so
right?
Popular.
Yeah, and what we, for most people, what they know is, first thing is speed goes away after a while sometimes, most of the time. And so if you're living on speed and you're not learning to become better at targeting and setup and, working your opponent, then over time it starts breaking down. And so you have to watch, if you find yourself always in that speed mode, your career may not be as long when you hit that spot where you're like, why am I losing? Well, maybe your speed's off. Maybe somebody or other people are starting to compensate for it. There's a lot of things there. So, but it's also hard to change once you have it, because it's no different than living on adrenaline. It's same place, right? Living on emotion is very dangerous, because your emotions can change anytime. So, Sivrid, you're kind of in the midst of a change, and you fell right into what Eli talks about, falling back into your old stuff here and there. And tell us what you're going through.
All right, so I've been coming back after a long break, but before in the styles I went through originally were more open form heater, then rapidly into a center grip, where I block a lot with my sword and for all the stuff on top and block the shield on the bottom. And coming up to Detroit, well, that's you learn pretty quickly that that's a good way to die, especially when you're fighting Rongwelder. And so one of the things I've been working on is changing over to more integrating Detroit A-frame style. So having up the blocking the sides with one side with the shield, one side with the sword, and making that change has been kind of goofy because I go through. Sometimes it'll be perfect. I'll keep my guard up nicely. Other times, my son joked. He joked at practice the other day. He said to one of our new fighters, "Just swing at his head. He'll move his shield out of the way." And sure enough, he swung his head, and I went half into the old block, and I didn't get the old block finished, so he just hit me in the head. So it's those kinds of things that happen. Eli was talking about this before. You just kind of suck for a while as you're trying to change over and fix those things. And so then for the rest of the evening, I did the same thing at Candlemass. Ruin hit me with one, and then after that, I'd like, okay, I got to stop doing that, and went back. And then the other temptation is then, I can't make that block. I'll block it with the old way. And then I get completely stuck with my arms crossed across my body. So
those deep ruts are a bitch, aren't they?
Yeah. and to rub salt in the wound at the same time, my son has been starting to fight over the same time, and he has none of these ruts.
Don't that suck?
So he's going through and he's learning all this very quickly. And so he's less like, why? So twice as fast. He picks up things twice as quickly, and he's 19. So it's been a humbling experience to see just how fast he learns where I'm working on struggling on relearning.
Yeah,
that's the power of that Shoshin, or the beginner's mind. It really is worthy of consideration, and it's not easy to once you have a certain level of experience to put that mindset back into your brain of being a sponge, absorbing and kind of rejecting what you had before it. And it's a blessing to be young when you don't have all those ruts already preset in.
Yeah. Being open and willing to listen is not easy when you've been there. I mean, it's so Eli, you talked about the sucking part of the learning cycle. Tell us some of the good part of where you ended up.
So I found at a point after a couple of years that, somebody will say to you, any fighter, get set essentially on guard in your stance. After a couple of years, I found that had completely changed for me. The way I stood changed. The way I moved changed. The way I saw things changed. The openings. It was terrific. And then I started having success in tournaments and doing pretty well. And that was I remember a particular point when I was fighting Duke Valharic, who's really good. He's left-handed. He's really good. We've known each other a very long time, and I won the fight. And wow, that made a real difference to me. It felt like, okay, and that was all with the new system, and I felt fully comfortable in the new system, and get to a point where I could fight. I felt comfortable fighting anybody. I didn't feel like, and I was starting to. By then, I'd already started to reintegrate some of my older techniques into this new structural base from it. And one of the things I really liked doing working with you, Brannos, was applying my background in instructional pedagogy to organizing
Mm-hmm.
what
I
you
would
were
agree.
what you were what you were teaching, what you were presenting into a structured learning system, and you know what things in what order and how to. So then I was able to start teaching what I'd been learning, and so that was really very, very satisfying.
And here we are.
Yeah, yeah.
So we have a question from the audience, you know, and this talks about how do you stay in the game after an injury at your age, and I'm gonna guess he's probably, you know, looking at a few of us. But so I'm not gonna go at whose age. I mean, we know Aelfwyn's younger than all of us, so it's all good. But I'm gonna throw this out to you, Ron, just because you talked about having some injuries and coming back from them. You know, and I have a couple other things in our comments. I'll post them in our comments here so we can talk about them later. But how do you do it?
Well, I've had to simplify what I do. I can't be as aggressive as I once was. My shoulder just won't put up with it. So I've had to train myself to be more patient. And that's always been my biggest flaw is patience. I've always wanted just to, Aelfwyn talked about, ADD. Well, it's something that affects a lot of us. And if a fight went too long for me back in the old days, my attention started to wander. So my entire tactic was to get the fight over with as quickly as possible. Well, once you've slowed down a bit and once you've injured yourself, you need to teach yourself patience. Now, that's a really major rut to try and fill in and pick a new path on. So basically what I would do is I would just is that I would just gear my mind to throw fewer shots, but throw them as accurately and as well timed as possible. And I've had to retrain myself. I really didn't have anybody around that could help me out of my path, because a lot of the people that were good in my region were people that I trained, and I couldn't get them to, it's kind of like, it's like, look, I'm having issues here, it's like, and they're like, but you taught me. It's like, I know, but I taught you to be critical and teach back. It's like,
Yes, exactly.
so, but eventually I was able to break through with a few of them, and I got some good pointers on just being more patient and being more accurate and being more methodic in what I do. I've had both my ACLs replaced, and that meant I kind of had to relearn movement. And Brannos has been good enough at the last two Penzics to work with me on my movement, which was never a strong point on mine before. I was always very just straight in there and start throwing, and I've learned. Hopefully, I've had some success in the videos since the videos I've sent you, Brannos, that retraining myself how to move and how to think. But it's a tough process. It is not something you can do overnight, and I've had some setbacks in my effectiveness, as Eliahu did with him when I was teaching myself that, because when you're used to a certain tactic, changing tactics, you're not as effective for a while, and when you've gotten to a certain level, that's very tough to take when people that you were just beating to death at previous practices are starting to get the better of you. It's but once again with the patience thing. So
yeah, it's interesting. In the comments, somebody said embrace pain, and I'm going to throw this one a little bit. Eli had said, first recovery and rehabilitation of injury, then preparation and prevent further injury or re-injury, and then adaptation of technique, and that's the order it goes in, and that's 100%. But I was reading through another article, and somebody brought up the pain point, and this talks about getting older and fighting, and there's things that you do, and what they talk about is you lose energy, and you don't even realize it until it's gone. Pain becomes a constant companion. so there's get used to it. Pain is part of it. You just have to evaluate that pain, and that's the hardest. I think for me, that's the hardest part. Your mind's changed. It's what you believed before, and maybe isn't the same. Well, you believed that it was worth just throwing wraps until the end of day because you're not going to break, and now you're like, I'll throw one today, and right. A lot of times back then, everything we did was, more important than anything else in our life. And as we grow, we find other things that are important into our lives, our relationships, our kids, or, all of our families, all of those things you start balancing that a little bit. Doesn't mean that that you're going to fight worse or any of those other things here. But time changes us all. Right. And I think that's the one of the large points to make. So
I have a comment.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I mentioned that when you're injured, first you have to focus on recovery and rehabilitation from injury. And then how do you prevent injury or re-injury? And then you may have to adapt your technique. But one thing that I've tried to instill in newer fighters is what they need to do to prevent injury in the first place. And this is when someone is young and in their mind indestructible, it is very difficult to get them to necessarily understand that if you intend to do this for as long as some of us have been doing it, you'll be better off if you prevent injury in the first place by a combination of exercise, training, technique, all the things, stretching and supporting your joints and not doing techniques that are going to more likely to injure you, and all of those things. And again, it's what ruts are you putting in? I think all of us have you can refer to it as a ritual, but it's a methodology for how you put on your arming clothes, how you put on your armor, how you prep your weapons, how you do to get into the mind for fighting. The physical ritual of doing that helps you get your mind right. But if people include in that things like dynamic stretching, warm-up stuff to get the blood flowing so as to decrease the likelihood of stress and strain injuries, that becomes simply part of what they do. It's like a little kid learning that here's what you do before going to bed. You brush your teeth, and all of those rituals make that part of your getting ready to practice. I see, or fight in a tournament, I see people throw on their armor and go out there and go full speed, and they haven't warmed up and they haven't done anything to prepare their body. It's like somebody going to a gym and immediately starting to lift heavy without warming up by doing repetitions of light weights. So that I think is something that can be learned from the get-go rather than having to learn it after the fact, after the injury, as so many of us have.
Yeah, it's interesting. And Aelfwyn, you do this all the time. You taught me a lot of stretches while over COVID, to tell you the truth. So is that something you did all the time?
Yeah, actually, it's because I spend a lot of time in the gym. Like Eliahu was saying, is you do your warm up. So I'd go to practice and I'd do some squats and some torso twists and move your arms around. And Duke Nigel introduced me to club exercises. So I started using those, just using my sword upside down at practice, just to get all the motions going. and it's been very, very helpful for that.
Tristan, just to throw us back on the subject a little bit, that we kind of covered the question to death a little bit there, but it was a great question. That's, I think, why we wanted to cover it. Have you had somebody come, like, maybe from another martial art and like, I want to learn this? I mean, I guess, one good thing about martial arts is when you go from one school to the other, you're forced to learn everything new again, right?
Well, yeah, and yes, I have. I've had a number of black belts that have come to my school, and they've come from different arts, and they want to learn learn what I teach. And it's always kind of funny because I watch for two things, and that is, first is mindset, because I've had both. I've had people that have come in, even that have been shy of saying that they have previous experience elsewhere, and they'll usually come in and they'll say, "I'm here to learn what you have to show," and usually even that language is not the type of language that somebody who's new to martial arts uses. That's somebody that has previous martial art experience, but they don't want to say it. Probably because they would not want to have me or the instructors be jaded about, oh, well, you're coming from another art and therefore your art was not as good as ours, or any of that other political garbage. But the second thing I look for is the physical, those ruts. You can spot them from a mile away. And usually when I find people that come in from other karate styles, whether they're Taekwondo or some of that, you see long, deep stances. Their feet are just programmed to go into the stance that they're used to, and they snap into it instantly. I mean, you don't even have to be on a mat 30 seconds before you can spot a pattern that has been set pretty deeply into their body's programming. And then of course, as a coach, and I think we wanted to talk a little about this at some point, is, okay, now you're trying to coach somebody through how to give up on their old habits. And of course, the first thing is be kind. And second is to realize they're going to take time. They're not going to fill in those ruts in a day. So don't come down on them hard for doing it. Be kind, say, okay, I can see you have this habit. Let's try to shore this up. And the point that I wanted to raise with what Eliahu said a few moments ago, and then Ronald even talked about, which was, when you are rebuilding, and this is something that occurred to me as both of them spoke, was you rebuild from the ground up. If you're not fixing footwork and movement from the feet, from the waist down, all you're doing is slight changes and modifications or tweaks to your fighting style. If you're really going to overhaul it, you're going to go right down to what your feet are doing. And this echoes, what I've learned on the mat and teaching, karate people and number of styles love those deep stances. Well, they're not very mobile. They can be strong for certain angles, but they're weak for certain angles, very weak and vulnerable, and they leave you immobile. And so when it comes time to change them, that will take a long time to retrain that body to narrow the stances up enough so that that body can still be mobile. And the first time I got exposed to this was when I was coming up in Aikido, and we had a young lady who was a daughter of one of the other students. They were both students, and she had what I call dancer foot. Every time she shifted her weight onto her front foot, the toe went out like a dancer, because she was a dancer. She was only 12 years old, but she had enough dancing that foot came up and the toe tapped down. I said, well, that's very aesthetically pleasing, but that foot doesn't do you anything for trying to be stable. And it literally took us, for a young mind, and we're talking, she was 12 and trained through she was 18. Even in that sponge age of being able to absorb things very quickly, it still took us 2, 3, or 4 years before that dancer foot started to sit down and stay on the floor when she was moving. So those ruts can be formed very quickly, very young, and even at that young age, it can take a while to get over. But changing the footwork will test the deepest part of your programming and where your mind's at. If you can do that, then the sky's the limit. You can go well beyond where you're at. But if you can't change your footwork and your movement, the rest is just, I'd say, kind of cosmetic.
So, it's interesting. We had a question kind of on this. And now that we're actually in the coach's side of this, Bess asked, how do you overcome the resistance to change a habit of a student has, and I'm going to call out, I'll first apologize to Eli with the with the you got to be kind. I wasn't always a kind coach. So and I bet you after the first two practices, I had told Eli I knew I wasn't a kind coach, and I told him this is gonna be difficult for me. Because when I came in, he's kind of my hero. He's the person I want to be, and so to bring my training style on top of it, that was very, very difficult for me. And in fact, I was so uncomfortable that Eli was 2 or 3 times after I had to go and have a talk with you. And
yeah, we had a conversation about it, and I told you, I don't care how you think you need to do it. I'm going to take the information and what you're presenting. I'm going to take as much as you can possibly give me. The way you present it doesn't concern me. I can see through that. I've worked with shitty bosses and colleagues and professors and teachers, and for a long time, you were a pussycat compared to a lot of them. So, it was, I can see how the tough love, tough coach approach, whatever it is you do, can really affect a lot of people. And I think I told you, however you need to do it, that's fine.
Yep.
I'm going to ignore your bullshit and just take what I need from you. I'm focused on learning. I'm focused on the technique. I'm focused on what I'm doing and how to learn to do it. And if you need to, you push me, great, fine. All the rest of it, I was able to let go and didn't affect me. I knew you were uncomfortable with it. But that was your discomfort, was your problem, not mine.
No, 100%. And I got past that, which was good.
Yeah.
And, and I guess, the way I taught back then was there's a lot of, I point straight out. If you did something wrong, be like, do you really want to do that? And there were cases where, like, you do that again, you're going to go sit down. It's, know, and that's the way, sometimes the feedback has to be different. If people aren't taking feedback in a way that they're going to make them listen, then you make them listen. I mean, a lot of feedback in the society is all based on, pain. Some people don't have that as a loop in their how they learn. So you have to give them others. I had another fighter that they had enough armor on. Pain wasn't a feedback mechanism. So, but they were highly motivated around adrenaline. And so I finally was like, all right, if you get hit, you're going to go sit down for 2 minutes. And boy, they wrote every bad word about me in their journal for those 2 minutes, and then they can go fight again. And, they got knighted and they did great. But boy, they hated me for a while. So you have to find what your student needs. And I think that's the big part. And that also comes with, I guarantee you, there are so many times people throw something, it doesn't hit their opponent. And I'm like, perfect. Because it was a perfect blow. It doesn't have to hit your opponent to be a perfect blow.
Right. You also, any instructor, and for those who don't know, I teach at a university, you have to understand in communication, not just teaching, but any communication, how the person you are teaching or talking to needs to hear it, not how you need to think you want to say it necessarily, but how they need to hear it. And for some people, as you said, Brannos, that was for that student, that's exactly what they needed. Yep. For me, I needed to understand the reasons for things. I needed to understand what you do it this way. Well, why do I do it this way? You do it and you do this way. Why? And you were very good at explaining the reasons behind everything. Because but that's me. That's how I learn. And understanding it and then repeating it. But other people learn differently. Other people don't want to know why, don't need to know why. They just need to know what to do. So you have to understand who the student is to understand what they need. And students have an obligation to understand how they learn so they can help with it and help direct their own learning. People need to understand their own learning styles, and we talked about learning styles in a
right at the beginning.
Years ago, I think. So,
yes. So Aelfwyn, you wanted to talk a little bit about this. Actually, everybody wants to talk about this, so it's going to be fun. It's going to be a great conversation, I think. Go ahead.
Well, we've all had our own experiences, both receiving and giving on that one. So as has already been mentioned, it's matching your coaching styles with the learning style of your student. Because if you're not talking the same language, you're not going to make that connection. And if you don't get buy-in from the student, then you're just going to be running into a wall. And as I mentioned in the comments on our side here, you got to be careful not to make the student stubborn. Because I know I went through that when I was early on. I was fighting a very active strapped round. It was working for me. And one of our local knights just kept telling me, it's a stupid style. It's a stupid style. It's a stupid style. I'm going, well, it worked. Like I beat you. So, and it wasn't until somebody said to me, okay, you've maxed that style out. That I'll buy, right? Because that makes sense.
Yeah.
But just telling me it's stupid is just going to make me stubborn, and I'm going to prove to you that it's not. So this is something I've seen. I've seen it in fighting. I'm also a motorcycle instructor, and I've seen this with the students in the motorcycling, especially people coming in and they've been riding dirt bikes since they were little kids. And now you put them on a street bike and they're trying to do the same dirt bike stuff. And you're going, okay, nope, back it up. And you got to find a way that they will listen, that they'll get buy-in on it. And then you show it to them and they go, oh, now I see. Now you can work from there. But if you just get in their face about it, some people, they like that. Other people, they don't. This whole learning through pain thing, I absolutely despise because that's not my thing. That just pisses me off. And then you lose. If you use a system that makes your student lose respect for you, then you're done, right? So if you're just going to, you're going to learn how to block that because I'm going to keep hitting you in the leg until you're black and blue. Well, now I just think you're an idiot and you're an ass, and I'm never going to listen to a word you say again. So that method might work with some students. Other students, it's a complete dead end. So it's trying to find that connection with your student and, okay, what are they going to listen to? Do I explain this style or say, okay, you're using this style? That's a tool in your toolbox. Here's another style, which is also a tool in your toolbox, right? And then you just add it to your toolbox rather than saying, don't do that, do this. Hey, you can use both. And then when they start using the new style and realize it's more effective, okay, then they work from there. So it's a lot of approach. So sometimes the tough love works and sometimes it really, really doesn't.
Brannos, you're muted.
Oh, Tristan, you had something to.
Well, I don't know if I could top any of what's been said already. It's what everybody has said is very accurate. My observation is that different students have vastly different needs and desires of what they want in their coach. Some love being yelled at like a drill sergeant, and they love doing push-ups and they love being screamed at. And they require that in order to motivate them. They're actually looking for that motivation. And I would say in terms of the pain thing, pain is not a good teacher. It is only a good motivator. If somebody's highly motivated but given no direction, you have no idea what they're going to try to do to solve the problem of being in pain. And this is kind of what brought me to what I think is effective teaching, and that is be direct. You don't have to be harsh, but you have to cut through the nonsense and give somebody the direct, shortest path between where they are right now and where they want to go. But be ready when they're not ready to go there. it will take them time to process what it needs for them to take the next step. And that I've seen it take days, I've seen it take weeks, months, even years for somebody to get to the point where you've told them time and time again, here's what you're going to need to do to improve and solve the problem you're having, whether you've hit the ceiling, you're in a plateau, you're not getting over your problem. Here's what you're going to need to do to proceed. But just be ready for them not to be able to go in the one time you tell them, okay, yeah, I can do that. I'm going to change. And then they do change and then they fix it. Like, it just doesn't work like that. Be patient as a coach to say and realize it will take them time. And at one time, they'll surprise the shit out of you when they walk up to you and say, I finally got it. I finally got what you've been telling me for 5 years. It finally dawned on me what that means. And now I can't believe I was so stupid. I didn't even realize what you told me. That's how it goes. So I realized that, and I felt the same way myself as a coach and as a teacher. I wanted my students to succeed so badly that I almost wanted to shake them by the collar why they weren't why they weren't advancing, because I was giving them the exact roadmap they needed to follow. What I didn't understand as a coach at the time was they not only need the roadmap, but they need the time to realize what they're doing and be patient, be supportive of that. If you try to force it on them, like you said, you'll get the stubbornness, you'll get the adversarial thing. You're going to probably start tearing down the trust that they have in you as a mentor. Maybe not, but in my experience, it's more often than not, you will start to destroy the trust. And if a student thinks, wow, I'm really pissing this guy off, I'm not going to bother him anymore to try to learn anything because I'm making him angry. And that's not the relationship you want to have with a student. So be ready for them to take the time, and it'll happen. But that's just my experience with many students over the years.
Yeah, I think sometimes you just have to make them believe that they can, right? And sometimes that's the hardest part to get them to.
Yeah, and to try to help them tear down the walls they've built around their own mind.
That's correct.
But realize that those walls can be not only tall but very thick. It takes time for them to tear them down. Yeah. So as much as you want to tear them down for them, all you can do is just help them by giving them a little flicker of light for them to try to go towards.
Yeah, you give them the tools to tear it down themselves. I mean, that's right. What it comes down to. So yeah, and Ron, I love yours that you brought up in our comments about your squires bringing duct tape stuff to practices. Go ahead and throw it out there. I love that one because I actually, one of the greatest wrestlers sat at our greatest wrestling coaches ever sat at a practice and threw apples at his guys. So.
Yeah. What he's referring to is one of my students gave me duct tape and rattan wrenches based on the movie Dodgeball. I'm like, is this a message? But I mean, I'm not a big believer in now. I mean, when I was in my 20s, I was a little.
We'll give him a chance to catch up and come back. I think we lost him a little bit. So, Ron, why don't you go ahead and rejoin us when you can?
Can I just add one little thing about the tough love?
Yeah.
Because I think this is something that has been around for a long time, and the idea that of tough love, and that tough love isn't necessarily being angry or showing rage or disgust.
Oh, wait a minute. Okay. Oh, sorry.
Oh, yeah, I was just feeling I'd just wrap up here just a moment. But that is that tough love, really, honesty can be very tough.
Yeah.
And it's honesty from the coach's perspective, it can be tough to deliver. And from the student's perspective, it can be difficult to hear. So the fact that you're honest means that you're being direct. And that's kind of the point I was getting to, was be honest and forthright. Don't make your student chase around for extra time trying to figure out what you're talking about or what they should be doing. but that honesty can seem like it's tough, but it really is a sort of respect where you say, I'm not going to waste your time, but here's what you need to do, and here's what you're doing wrong. That should never be viewed as being harsh, but it can kind of feel like that sometimes.
Yeah, I would agree, and I think that's how Bess would rather have it than think on this well. So I will go back to Ron real quick.
Yeah, sorry about that. It just
That's all
froze
right.
in the middle of a sentence, and a very inappropriate part because a bad part because it made me seem like a real jerk. But generally, how I deal with stubborn students is if it's something I think is going to injure them, like throwing high wraps, or blocking a certain way with their sword, or something that's going to injure them. Having been around for as long as I have, I've seen a lot of very good people come and go, and some of them had some very bad habits, which were ultimately their demise, like their shoulder, their wrist, their elbow. So when someone says, well, I block this way, it's just how I do it, it works for me. And I'm like, okay, well, did you ever hear about so-and-so? They're like, no. Or so-and-so. No, of course you haven't. They've been around since they messed up their shoulder, wrist, elbow, whatever, doing what you're doing right now. So do you want to be somebody who's doing this for a long time, or do you want to be somebody who's a name from the past that only the old timers know? Your choice. I try and explain to my students the best that I can exactly why what I'm telling them to do or not do is going to work or not work. Like what the and what the long range issues with that.
Ron, you're breaking up again. If you might want to drop and rejoin.
Maybe.
Okay, so we're going to jump back and see if Ron can rejoin in a second
or
here.
Throwing high wraps or whatever.
Oh, there he is. Hey, Ron. Okay, we're going to let him go.
So wait, I was told that this was your first trip away.
So let's go back to, there's a couple of folks that had a couple. There was actually a question. One question was another good question for Bess was, do you think we can max out a style? I mean, can you really max out that style? I'm gonna throw this one at you, Aelfwyn, because I think she got that from your conversations. Change things up when you go back to a style. Specifically, she's talking about your strapped round, and then improve your old style. So in other words, can you go max out where you can get with your style, try some different things, and then merge those things together back into maybe the original style you had?
Yeah, so rather than discuss strapped rounds versus heaters versus center boss specifically, why don't we just look at plateaus in general, which I think is more in keeping with the theme of the night. And I put into our comments a quote that I found once, and it's regarding the role of deliberate practice, which is a theme that's come up on Coach's Corner a bunch of times. So in there, it's defined a plateau of skill acquisition where no further improvements are attained, and they are overcome by an effortful reorganization of the skill. So that's taking a look at what your plateau is, really analyzing what your skill process is within that plateau, and then finding the points where you're stuck, right? And then your deliberate practice is taking those very, very specific parts. So not, the style in general, but a very specific part of your style, and then deliberately practicing the improvement to that. So you have to look at it. I'm an engineer. I look at it in the scientific method. Here's my problem. Here's a number of different solutions. Let's try all these different solutions, find the best one, and then work on that until I've got it down, and then go to the next specific issue. So this is really hard, especially if you're working on your own, because you need somebody with the experience to look at you as well, give you that other pair of eyes to give you the feedback, because you don't know what you don't know. So if I'm doing something and I'm plateaued, it's really hard for me on my own to figure out what it is I'm doing wrong, or not necessarily wrong, but could be improved. But if I do video analysis with Brannos or whoever, or another experienced fighter at the practice says, when you do this thing, you have this little quirk, right? So let's take a look at that little quirk, figure out why you're doing it, what its effect is, and then find your solution to that. The Coach's Corner on video analysis talked about that, where you find the decision point in the video. This is where the problem was, where I lost the fight, where my shield was out of position, where I was out of position, and you back up, 10 seconds or whatever. What are the steps I did that led to that point? And now you got a thing that you can fix. So to go back to Bess's question, can you fix the plateau? Yes, it takes a lot of work, and it takes deliberate practice, which is what practice is supposed to be for, is finding these little things and working on them, and then reevaluating. So in general, yes, it can be done. Some things, there is only so far you can go with them, like my good old strapped round. But like I say, these are all different things that you can work on. There are different tools in your toolbox. Let's figure out where the gaps are, narrow it down, fix the problem, move on to the next one. So.
You're muted again, Brannos.
This is back to reflect on, what's going on. Take time for reflection, and that's what you have to do. It's exactly in this question, really. I think. I think the good part here is we're talking about the comfortability, and actually, when Ron brought this up almost first in this scenario, was that his squires, who were probably knights by then, were still uncomfortable training him, as no different than what I talked about with Eli. And I think the key is both of you really, that's what you really wanted, right? And that we have to respect the things you want. So, Ron, how did you end up getting somebody to actually help you?
I reached out to you.
Yeah.
I reached out to. I also reached out to a couple other people. I reached out to Sagan. I talked to him through Teams or whatever, or and when I go to Penzic, I seek people out. I say, okay, what am I doing wrong? I mean, if Paul was at last Penzic, I would have reached out to him, because he was the guy that taught me the basics. And I was very fortunate in the fact that I had some of the best teachers of the late 70s to get me started. I had, Paul, I had Sagan, I had Andrew Vriga, I had, I had a number of really good teachers. So I had very good basics, and I think good basics are essential to use as a platform for everything else to be built on. Because I took everything they taught me and I built on it over the years. So when I had to kind of reinvent myself after injuries, I had a good base to build off of. And to me, that was very important, because I had all the body mechanics and the movement, but I needed some refining, which one of the things, my biggest Achilles heels was movement, which is why, I'd send you videos, we'd get together at Penzic for an hour or so, that kind of thing. So, I mean, the learning never stops. And, if you think you're too good to learn, then, well.
I got a question, I guess, Eli, is, and you might just answer it, no, I had, this is what I just wanted to do. Was it hard to actually, reach out and make that decision, to make that wholesale commitment?
And I think it was harder for you than it was for me.
I know it was. So,
But I was surprised at the hardest thing was people's reaction.
yeah.
I think because I'm always learning. I'm always trying to learn. I always have things. I don't think I know everything. I know more than I can run faster. I don't have to outrun the bear. I just have to outrun you. You know, I know a lot of stuff, but I'm still learning. I'm always learning, and that's the way I approach things. So I think that given the hierarchy and deferential nature of the society, it can be difficult when it could be difficult for other people when I say, "Hey, would you teach me this?" But it wasn't difficult for me. But that's who I am. I think that was informed though by what I've seen of other people who were absolutely resistant to learning. They thought they figured it out. They learned everything. They didn't need to learn anything else. And the not just fighting, but especially fighting passed them by. And I didn't want to be one of those people. You know, if you've ever listened to Bruce Springsteen's Glory Days, you know what I'm talking about. It's those guys, you know. I didn't want to. So, Miles Davis, great jazz trumpeter, Miles Davis. Somebody said, "Well, Miles, you're a legend." He said, "Don't call me a legend. A legend is a guy who used to do it. I'm still doing it." And he never stopped inventing and recreating and learning and mastering new stuff. Picasso was an asshole, but he learned, he kept reinventing himself, you know? And those are some of my examples. So I didn't find it difficult at all because I still wanted to be good. And I knew that this is what I wanted. I had to change what I was doing. I had to learn. So, okay, now I learn. And I didn't, yeah. So it wasn't difficult for me, but I recognized that it was difficult for other people.
Okay. No, I was kind of interested in knowing, and I know you're, you know, one of those forever learners, but you know, I think the hardship is actually making that decision to you know, it's time for change and being, you know, and then being committed to that decision.
Well, that I recognized the moment when it was a tournament. I was fighting Ronald, and he just picked me apart effortlessly, and I thought, this is, yeah, no, I have to, no. I've been just, you know, coasting for a while. It's time to learn how to deal with this. Not that I can still deal with Ron Valder's fighting, but but at least I understand how he's beating me. So,
so Ron, you had just a quick comment on this too, I believe.
It was on what I was telling you earlier about not being able to get feedback and critiques from people that I raised. Something I started doing with some of the people that I've been training, and I've been doing it more and more at practices, is towards the end of practice, I say, okay, let's all talk about what our flaws are.
A great idea.
And I point to each person and I say, look, what can I improve? What did you see that I did wrong? And if they say nothing, I'm like, no, try again. We're just going to stand here until you tell me what I'm doing wrong. And and what that does is that helps create a new generation of trainers that, you know, because I don't want them just to learn shot A, shot B, shot C, block A, block. I mean, I want them to learn how to think. I want them to learn how to identify flaws in even people that they perceive as being much better than them, because that's how you get to be better, is you learn is you learn to analyze, you learn to think, you learn to pick out flaws, and it, you know, and it's been tough with some of my students, it but in the long run, it's made them better fighters, and it's made them better coaches at the same time. And I'm a big believer in building your replacements, because I'm not going to be here forever. None of us are, and I want the next generations not to, to be better than we were. So that was my comment. I kind of forgot to include it in the last time I talked.
Okay, Sivrid, just because I'm interested. I mean, you came back after a period of time, and all new trainers, all new styles. Seeing your son, just jump in 2 feet and trying to keep up. Believe me, that's the way I feel at practice with every new person that shows up. But did you actually end up just saying, "Hey, I'm gonna go ahead and make this change and commit to it"?
Well, I think one of the things, actually, it's strangely enough, it's partly the show. I was listening early on, and some of it was really talking about what Tristan was talking about with the empty cup, and how if I was going to I knew I was coming back, and I knew that fighting had, at least in the mid-realm, had made some changes. And so I'm like, well, if I'm going to deal with some of these changes, I have to listen. And I have to be able to say, okay, what are they? And I would find out they would work or they wouldn't work. And so I would be able to go back to what I knew before if they didn't work. But quite honestly, I've made, fighting better than I have before. So I figured that they've made some progress, definitely. And so for me, part of that learning was just figuring out what worked. And it did take a little bit of saying, okay, I'm going to set aside what I know and try to learn something different. And that was intentional, knowing that I was coming up to you guys' practice, and knowing that there was a lot of skill there that I obviously was not being able to match. But even before we started heading up there, when you're doing online practices, it was learning new techniques and bringing me back up to speed, because I knew that I was, kind of out of date, as it were. And it's like, well, how do I get back up to speed and to what is currently, being, well, cutting edge, or not necessarily cutting edge, but at least state of the art. And
Yep.
So having to make that an assessment and saying, that was a lot of my motivation when I came back, was how do I bring myself back up to the state of the art, as it were.
No, that's cool. I'm happy you made that choice and you stuck to it. I think that's again, I really appreciate that. I change a lot all the time. I love finding new stuff and driving myself to try to be better. But the stuff that you guys have done to wholesale change is a whole different commitment to what you're doing, and I think that's one piece that people need to remember this is a really, really big commitment to say, I'm going to change. Now, the good part is sometimes when you're an experienced fighter, and some people are like, okay, you go do your own thing. Well, if your own thing is like, you know what, I found somebody that's going to train me over here, and that's the style I want to learn, they're not going to bug you to trade, to essentially go back to whatever style you were, because they don't have that much interest in the first place. So, the good part is you have some opportunity to learn from other people, because maybe you don't have that same, you have to fight like us pressure at your practice, because beyond that already. We have a couple of questions.
One more comment.
Yeah.
And so one of the things I was thinking about as you were talking about, well, how do you go back and retrain when you're already at the top of the game? So if you've been at the top of the game, like you or Ron trying to come back, it does put an interesting pressure on someone who's coming up, because at the same time, you don't want to say, well, I'm going to ignore what you say. I have a full cup and I'm going to ignore what you say and give you advice. But at the same time, because there's that balance that doesn't occur naturally. And so for, if Ronald, if you're saying, okay, trying to learn from people who I've trained, there's still this deferential student-teacher relationship. And so from the student point of view, sometimes that's a hard place to get past without being respectful, without seeming disrespectful.
Yeah, and I think that was my point with Eli a lot, right? Is I did not want to feel disrespectful, and I think that's what happens with a lot of students. It's also just what I, just like I just said, is like maybe sometimes that's good because Ron can go or go somewhere else and say, you know what, I'm going to try this stuff, and people at practice are like, Ron's doing something new. We'll just let him do his thing, So that's the good part. So real quick, because we're hitting our end of our, we got about 9 more minutes. I want to go ahead and cover 2 more questions. Tristan, you want to address these?
Sure. Let's take them in order. Why don't you throw them up on the screen and read them? The first one is regarding the.
There you go.
There we go. All right. If teachers are a finite resource, would newer fighters feel jealous of their time being taken up with someone who's already enjoyed victories at tournaments? Boy, trying to predict how other people will feel is always a wild grab bag. In fact, I would caution people not to try to presume to predict how other people feel. Certainly you should try to read them for it, but I would say that it's easy for somebody to think, well, this person's very successful. This fighter's won a lot of tournaments. Why would they ever want to spend time showing me something? In my experience, don't let that shyness keep you from going and introducing yourself and even just asking. It's like, hey, can you help me out? Or would you be willing to help me out? I think you'd be surprised that people that have experience and skill are eager to share it. They will sometimes, I guess, perhaps be dismissive if you catch them at the wrong time. Maybe they're busy doing other things, but you show respect by saying, can you help me? I would like you to impart maybe just a little bit of your knowledge to help me out. You'll probably find more often than not that experienced people will take the extra time to just even spend a few minutes with you and give you something that can help you learn. And this kind of covers the respect topic everybody was talking about just a few minutes ago. And I guess that's the key. We could probably do an entire episode on how to show respect, whether you are a newer student and you're looking to a mentor. How do you show proper respect to them? And then as a coach or a mentor, how do you show respect to the younger people that are hungry for your knowledge, that want it, and you can offer them something to help them. Like that is what builds the society. That's what builds any group, to have that mutual respect back and forth. It shouldn't be awe or peer fear or anything that you can take it too far into something that winds up being toxic. And from both sides, you can take being humble to the point that you are afraid to talk to anybody, as well as from the mentor side, you can be so filled with yourself that you feel like dealing with new people is beneath you, that you have squires to go do that or what have you. So there's always a balance of keeping the virtues offsetting the virtue of your prowess with the virtue of your humility and your largesse and your generosity. Those things need to be kept in balance. And I think when they are, everybody benefits.
Yep. I think that covered both of them, and I think the piece, I just want to throw a point, and then we're going to go to everybody. We got about 5 minutes. I want to make sure everybody has the last chance to talk. But, I think when you have finite resources and that jealousy comes out, those are the times a good teacher says, hey, let's everyone come over and gather that information from each other, because we only have finite resources. Hey, I'm going to show them this. Let's all, do this. Anybody interested, come on over. I'm showing this. And then I think at a good practice, communication is the biggest thing. If a great fighter comes in and you see somebody spending a lot of time with them, the first time they come in, you look for your opportunities, because that person came in, you got some opportunities to fight another great fighter. You even have the opportunity to learn from them, because no matter what they had was still darn good. And they still have all those core principles that are the same ones they're still going to use at the core. They may be learning a new style. They may be learning new movement. They may be drawing these things together, but they still know sword blows. They still know all of that core principle. So, when you have finite resources and somebody comes in, then those finite resources, you get 2 instead of 1. So, you're getting a benefit. So I'm going to go ahead and roll through a few people. We're going to go in a little bit of reverse order here this time. I think Sivrid, you got, since you're on the show and you get the ultimate call at the end of shutting us down. So you got anything else you want to talk about?
No, I don't have anything else I want to add on this one. I just enjoy the being able to go through and talk about some of the changes, because it has been interesting going through a lot of changes in my fighting, and it's been really for me it's been really worthwhile making those changes, because I think I've come a better fighter out as a result.
Awesome. Aelfwyn.
Yeah, I was just kind of looking at my notes, and I talked earlier about getting into the vicious cycle of low motivation leading to poor performance, and you're just stuck in this little cycle. And then I was looking at our title, and it says quit or change. And I know for me I was in that point where I didn't know what to change, and I was looking at the quit option. And one of our knights just walked up and said, "Hey, I was thinking about something about your fighting, and I had this suggestion." And I didn't ask him for help. He just walked up and gave me the help. And that in and of itself, that somebody took an interest in me, kicked me out of the cycle. So we're talking a lot about teaching and coaching and working with people. Sometimes you have to take the initiative and just walk up and say, "Hey, I recognize that you exist. I see that you've got a problem. And if you'd like, I've got some suggestions." And sometimes that in itself is what they need. So that would be my concluding comment there.
Awesome. I would agree 100%. Tristan.
Well, I think we all get to a point, and it usually doesn't take too long before you have to press the undo button. Like, you have to start filling in those ruts. The longer you go, and then perhaps you get to that point, you say to yourself, "Well, there's some of those ruts I just don't want to fill in." And at that time, you do consider quitting or just saying, "Well, I guess I'll only be this good, and that'll be it." But underneath, usually I've noticed that there is the competitor that says, "No, I don't like that. I'm not gonna stick in that rut. I'm gonna fill it in."
Stop pointing at me, you bastard.
You are not the one that would come to mind when it comes to sticking in those ruts. But I think we've all been there at least a couple of times, and we do get inspired by other people to fill them in and learn new things. But it does take time. And this is how I can relate to my students when I realize, okay, they can hear something of, time and time again, but they're not ready to really absorb it. Because I was that person, exact same way. And so just seeing it and experiencing it from both sides helped me grow as both a competitor and as a mentor, to have that patience and to be ready to be there when somebody says, "You know what, I'm done being, I need to move on," and say, "I'm here. Here's my hand. Let's go. Let's do it." To me, that's what means the most.
I agree. That's a great point, man. It's the reason why I love being on this show. Ron.
Well, it's been a very interesting topic, and one that is very personal to me, because one of the issues I had is I was a very goal-oriented young fighter. I really wanted to be a Duke when I was a teenager. That's really what I wanted, and I did, and I strove to it, and I got there, and then I went, "Now what?" So then, I started training people, and I tried to endeavor to be the best trainer I could, but I also wanted to remain competitive as a fighter, which is, and this topic is of more interest to me than a number of others, in the fact that trying to keep competitive after being in the sport over 40 years is tough. I mean, those ruts after 45 years are really deep. I mean, and some of them are good ruts. As I mentioned before, I was trained by some of the best people of my era to train. And and with me, the learning never stopped. I mean, I'm always watching YouTube videos. I'm always keep myself as up to date on everything as possible. But I'm finding that I have to reinvent myself at this point if I'm going to keep doing this, because what I've been doing, although the foundation is good, a lot of what made me successful either is no longer relevant to the way fighting has changed, or or physically I just can't do it anymore. So thanks for having me on, and sorry for the technical difficulties.
Oh, no problem. Thanks for coming on. Eli, I left you for last, so you kind of spurred this whole episode for me. So
okay, thanks. I think that I mentioned briefly that I distinguish between a style of fighting and a system, and what I would encourage people to do is think about how they fight as part of the system of fighting that they use. Because when you think of it that way, it's easier to think about replacing, adding, changing parts of it than it is when you're thinking, well, I'm following a style. Well, do you understand that the footwork, the stance, the equipment, the movement, all of that is related? Every part supports every other part. That's a system. A style, I've seen people imitate without understanding because they're trying to copy a style. When you're trying to learn new things, it helps to have that base system into which you can integrate new techniques. The real challenge occurs, a bigger challenge occurs when you have a system and you realize you have to adopt a new system, because the old system is no longer a good foundation for new techniques. So you have to change the base of the foundation of the system. That's a significant change. But when you think of it that way, when you approach it that way, to me, that made sense to do it that way. But then I tend to follow the idea that your mind has to understand it before your body can master it. That's because that's the kind of learner I am. Understanding your own learning, method of learning, is important, what kind of learner you are. But I think conceptually understanding every part of how you fight as part of an integrated system is a useful approach for learning new tricks, new techniques. I don't call them tricks, but that was the title of the episode. Learning new techniques, or understanding that you have to fundamentally change the structure upon which you're basing the techniques, and then add new techniques back into it. So it's a conceptual approach, and that I found very useful.
all right. Well, something I want to just cover, just because I posted the article out there. It's a short one, but I thought it was pretty good. You may feel like maybe the age is catching up to you, and it's maybe time to call it. But I have to say, in the article they talk about, that one way or the other we all get there, right? But they also talk about that age brings on some things, and with age comes stuff that you never thought as well. And we talked about some of the things that happen with age, but here's some of the other positive things. Some people, this gentleman talks about, he's never learned to hit harder than he does now, and that's because he knows that line of power has been developed for lots of time. So you understand that physical line of power is so much easier for you that you don't have to think about it, and it just flows into place. After that many years of training something, that's what you get good at. It's you start seeing the punches, you start seeing the sword shots, you start seeing things way before, because you have so many years of seeing them already. You're like, I know exactly what that person's doing because I have seen it a billion times, right? You're able to correct your, errors better and faster because with age we learn, and and we're able to see and understand what we're doing better than we did when we were young. And that's a huge benefit. And you never, he says you never understood more about your art than you do now, and other than hopefully in the future. And what he means by that is you put this many years in, you have a lot better understanding than somebody walking in the room. Sometimes even that person getting knighted, because tell you the truth, they may be living on things outside the understanding of martial arts. Which is often, the physicality of martial arts. That's a lot of our nights live on the physicality of martial arts, adrenaline and emotion and those pieces. And they haven't truly sat and got a chance to learn everything else around it yet. They will, hopefully, but they haven't done it. And that's a benefit, that you understand it better. And the last one is you start learning that, he says you start learning some funky tricks, and I think that you thought were impossible. And I think what that means is you start letting go of rigid ideas that you kind of get started with. And because you start realizing it's like, oh, wait, can't cross my feet. There's a prime one in a day, right? But, they talk about breaking the rules, and some of the best boxers and best martial artists, they know how and when to break the rules. Right? We train everyone that there's fundamentals you should not do until you understand when to do them. And I think, as with age and fighting, that comes. So, but first thing I want to do is I want to thank Eli and Ron for coming out and sharing, their drive to do something more. And of course, I want to thank Aelfwyn for being on her first show with us, I think, right? Thank you. And I hope we see you back. Thanks for being producer. And Tristan, just thanks for being you and always showing up when I need you.
I'm there for you, brother.
And I love listening, and thanks for putting this all together. I can't thank you more. And we're entering the holiday season. We got a couple episodes left. So what's the next episode? You got that one?
I do. Duke Aelanon is hosting the Heroes and Traditions. This is Kaid this time.
Oh, awesome. Mm-hmm. Awesome. We got it in the right order, because I think when we first did that, we had it in the wrong order.
Somebody could quiz me on the order, and I'd say, I can't help you.
I know. So, well, we all hope you come and enjoy that one. That one has its own cult following, so it's kind of cool. And, going into the holidays, everybody be safe. Everybody give a chance to thank people and be around family and be around friends. And we look forward to finishing out the year with everyone and starting a new year. Thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you guys next week.
Have a good weekend, everybody.
Bye.